Hey folks, Nick here from another BookTube channel, and today I'll be reviewing Mine by Robert McCammon. If you're keeping up with this channel, you'll know that I recently read Boy's Life by McCammon, and it's an early contender for my top read of 2023, and Swan Song was my top read of 2022. So that led me to buying a stack of Robert McCammon books off of eBay. Mine is the first book off of that stack that I decided to read because the premise seemed the most interesting, and I'm a sucker for a die-cut cover. But does Mine stack up to the high expectations of Boy's Life and Swan Song? Let's get into it. From the outside looking in, Laura Claiborne has it all. She's a successful journalist for her Atlanta newspaper, her stockbroker husband Doug is rolling in dough, she's got a nice house, she's got great cars, and she has a baby boy on the way. To look at her, you'd never know that Laura was a flower child from the 60s protesting against imperialist America and fighting the establishment. But, as usually happens, kids grow up and they grow into the very establishment that they were fighting. Her past long behind her, Laura is tormented by the present. While Laura grew out of her hippie phase, Mary Terrell went hopelessly down the rabbit hole and never came out. Mary currently ranks high on the FBI's most wanted list and has been on the run for decades due to her involvement with a radical group called Stormfront that was responsible for countless murders and bombings throughout the 60s. The surviving members of Stormfront scattered to the winds with new identities, but Mary Terror, as she was known, is thinking of getting the band back together. Her mind warped by decades of LSD use, compounding her natural paranoia and diluting her reality, Mary kidnaps Laura's newborn son David and sets off on a deadly road trip to reunite with her Stormfront brethren. Terrified that further FBI involvement will cause Mary to hurt the baby, Laura sets off on her own to give chase to the insane kidnapper. I have a personal arbitrary rule where before you can claim an author as one of your favorites, you need to have read at least 3 of their books, assuming that they have at least 3 written. Mine is the 3rd book that I've read by Robert McCammon, so now I can say this with certainty. Robert McCammon is one of my favorite authors. What's so impressive about him is that the 3 books I've read could not be any more different from each other, and yet they are all excellent. Swan Song is a post-apocalyptic epic that blends fantasy and horror and has a massive cast of characters. Boy's Life is a heartfelt story of magical realism in the vein of Ray Bradbury that brought me to tears. And now Mine is a pulse-pounding horror thriller that had me on the edge of my seat. Each book reads very differently from the other, and yet they are all distinctly McCammon. The only other author I can think of that can write so many different types of stories this well is Stephen King. Since I mentioned King, I think that Mary Terror is a villain that would fit right at home in King's world. I had the sense reading the character that McCammon read King's Misery a few years earlier, saw Annie Wilkes, and thought, I can do better than that. Mary and Annie are both described as bigger, sturdier, more imposing women, and while their backstories are quite different, they do share a rather blasé attitude towards child murder. If Annie Wilkes decided to go on a road trip, it might look a lot like Mary's. But honestly, if I had to put money down in a fight, I'm betting it all on Mary Terror. What I like most about Mary as a villain is that even though she is unequivocally evil and there's no gray area, she still manages to be a complete character. She's not just mindlessly doing these horrible things, she has her reasons. Those reasons may be the results of holes in her brain due to extended drug use, but they are reasons nonetheless. The fact that she is so confident in her logic is probably the scariest thing about her. But at its heart, Mine is really a fantastic story about a mother going to the furthest lengths imaginable to protect her child. There's quite a bit of suspension of disbelief that you're going to have to employ here, which I don't really mind at all, because if you don't have that, then you're going to keep asking yourself questions like, why doesn't she just call the FBI in? Or, how did she find Mary in like 5 days when the FBI has been looking for 2 decades? That doesn't matter. Like, that's not fun. What's fun is watching this clean-cut woman who's never lifted a finger against anyone in her life going on this odyssey that puts her in challenging situations and tests her willingness to break her moral code to come through it all safely. Mine starts off really strong by giving us plenty of time to get to know Laura before her life completely falls apart. Laura is still dealing with trauma in her life. She had a horrible experience from her first story as a reporter, in which she was on site for a police standoff with a woman who was holding a gun on her own baby, and it went terribly wrong. On top of that, her relationship with her absentee husband is crumbling due to his overcommitment to his work, which turns out to be an overcommitment to another woman. The impending birth of David is the only thing keeping Laura going, which makes it all the more nail-biting as we cross-cut between her and Mary, who is actively planning the kidnapping of a baby from the hospital. McCammon takes his time getting to the actual snatch and grab, and even though we know that it's gonna be David that gets taken, the suspense leading up to that event is nerve-shredding. Once the cross-country chase begins, ironically, things kind of slow down a bit. I don't think that mine recaptures that extreme high of suspense that it achieved early on, but it still does succeed at being an edge-of-your-seat thriller right through to its bloody conclusion. If you are squeamish regarding violence towards very young children, I would skip it, but otherwise, I highly recommend this book. My arbitrary and subjective grade for Mine by Robert McCammon is 8 out of 10. Do with that what you will. If you've read Mine, let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. Thank you for spending some time with me today, but now it's time to get back to reading.